welcome to another episode of the Everyday Defender podcast. Back once again with my co-host Koos. Unfortunately, this time we are not in person. We are doing the time zone skip, and Koos is in the Netherlands. I am in rainy Australia at the moment. Good to see you, Koos.
Hey Chris, how you doing, man? It's sunny over here in the Netherlands, so we're already reversing the things we were talking about a couple of months ago.
Yep, it's already dark here, and man, I can't believe it's been like a month since we last saw each other. Already, like time just flies by so quickly. But exciting news is that it'll be just over a month, and we'll see each other again. So that's pretty awesome, isn't it?
5 weeks. We just discussed this right before we started recording. You're visiting the Netherlands, and I'm going to drive you around and do some sightseeing.
Yeah, I think that's going to be. Yeah, very much so. And I'm looking forward to the conference too, Experts Live Netherlands. I think it's going to be a great conference. I'm really excited. I've obviously been involved with some of the Experts Live conferences here in Australia and in the US before, but really excited about Experts Live Netherlands. I think it's going to be just a whole new level, right? Leveling up is what it's all about, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a 2-day conference for the first time ever. And I don't know from the top of my head, but in terms of amount of attendees, but it's a big conference. It's probably, I think it's the biggest Experts Live around the world. And you'll see the community is real in the Netherlands, and a lot of people will show up.
I'm excited. I really am. And I know they've been putting a lot of effort into the organizing of this. So I'm really excited. But on to, I guess, more immediate topics, right? For today's episode. I've been doing a lot of work with Intune over the last few months, probably the last, I've been doing a lot of work with Intune since, Intune really came out and since the days of the old Silverlight version of Intune, which I know anyone who's touched Intune since then will know the pain. But yeah, recently, one of the big projects I've been working on has been sort of looking at an Intune at a sort of fairly large scale. And in sort of my ponderings with this, I've been thinking a lot about the way to configure Intune, right? Because I think, as with pretty much anything in the Microsoft ecosystem or even in the IT world in general, there are always multiple ways to get something to work, right? Yeah. But just because it works doesn't mean it's optimal or it is as good as it can be. And so I had some thoughts about some things that I kind of find, common mistakes, if you will, when looking at Intune environments, and I wanted to share that with folks, because I feel like if you look at these things and you address these things, you'd have a better Intune deployment. It'll be more optimized and probably a little bit more secure. And then you look like you are the man with the AI plan today.
Yes. I have recently become a full-time Claude code user over the past month, and I want to share some things because I'm actually blown away about what this tool is giving me in a daily work. I'm trying to stay away from being too overhyped, and I'm also annoyed, like most of our listeners probably, about all the AI marketing speak we hear all the time. So I don't want to sound like that. I bring a couple of real-world stories to the table, of which I used Claude and Claude Code, and it really saved the day. Or actually multiple days worth of work, actually. So I really want to share them, and maybe it's a little bit inspiring as well for others to hear. And I also want to talk about all the different models and services which are out there nowadays. I'm talking Claude Code now, but we also have obviously Microsoft Copilot and GitHub Copilot, which also has their own CLI. And the industry is talking about the harness in which the AI runs. And I want to elaborate a little bit on what the harness actually is, and why a same model within a different harness might still feel completely different.
Interesting. Look, I think I like that, and I'm really keen to hear sort of your use cases and how this is kind of making your life better, right? Because I feel like for a long time we've been saying AI is there and it's a great technology, but it's missing a use case, right? Everyone's trying to make AI everything. But I think you need to have a good use case, and then it will help you execute on that. And learning from people like you and hanging out with people and seeing how they use it, I think is really important, right? I spent a lot of time with Nicholas Blank, who's a fellow MVP, when we were in the US last month, and I was traveling with Nick, and Nick uses Gemini, and he uses it as a voice assistant, but it is he's having full on conversations with Gemini to help him solve problems, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's awesome. I was really inspired by that because it kind of helped me kind of look at how I use AI and my use cases and go, you know what, maybe I should try doing this and this and this with it as well. So yeah, I think this is going to be great for our listeners to get some inspiration from the things that you are doing.
Yeah.
So
Well, it might even
uh,
save Nick on bills from his psychiatrist. I don't know. um,
yeah, we all need someone to talk to every now and then, don't you?
Of course, no.
So yeah,
I have three practical use cases and examples where I think on those use cases alone, the cost of this subscription was more than worth it. So, but
yeah.
let's dig into Intune first, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about Intune done wrong, right?
Okay.
For a second. So I think we all understand Intune is a really really powerful tool, right? It can do a lot for us. I think it's sort of vital to a secure posture, but it's not plug and play, right? There are too many times I see folks that they set up a few policies, they enroll a few devices, and then they sort of think they're done and they just leave it. And unfortunately, that's not how that works. And just because your tenant is reporting, 100% compliance doesn't always mean that every device is compliant, right? It may also be, an indicator that there's some failures or some issues with your policy setup and stuff like that. And so I've got just four things, four little things that I see that are kind of common mistakes for environments, and I kind of want to run through them and see, let folks know. And like I said, if you pay attention to these, it's likely you'll have a slightly more sort of efficient engine environment, right? So mistake number one is again the tyranny of the default, right? Leaving those default configs. And this one's quite big. So in Intune, there's a tenant-wide setting that determines how devices are treated if they do not have a compliance policy assigned. So the device enrolls, but there's no policy that actually targets that device. So by default in the tenant, what will happen is that device will show up as compliant. So it means that it automatically gets the green tick without any test checks or enforcement of any sort. And I've got a link in the show notes to where you can find the setting. It's buried in the config there in the Intune Admin Center and sort of what it looks like. But what you want to be doing with that is you want to make sure that when a device actually doesn't have a compliance policy applied to it or targeted to it, you want to set the setting to make that device not compliant, right? You'd rather have something explicitly fail than explicitly pass when it doesn't have a compliance setting. Really, really important to do. I think you want to not just go flip that switch, right? Either if you're looking at your tenant now while we're talking about this, and you see that you are set to compliant, which is the default setting, I would say that you probably want to use report mode in conditional access, set up a conditional access policy, and just monitor what these devices look like and see what your blast radius will be before you just flick that on. Because otherwise, you might be locking a lot of folks out, and you might be causing some problems, right? If you've got everything else set up correctly, that is. So coupled with that, there's a setting there about compliance validity, compliance status validity, right? And really what that means is how long will my device stay in this compliant state if it doesn't actually check in with Intune? Now, by default, that's 30 days. So your device can check in today. It will stay compliant if it is compliant today for 30 days before, if it doesn't check in again. That can be a real sort of a bit of a pain. And so I would often say to customers, evaluate that setting as well. Personally, I think 14 days is probably a better value for that setting. You don't really want devices that are disconnected or whatever from your environment being able to still be compliant after 30 days necessarily, right? But there are use cases for that. So I have a mining customer who they have users who work 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off in these mining sort of shift swings. Now, for folks like that, when they're not working, their laptop doesn't get powered on, right? And it's a nightmare for vulnerability management. It's a nightmare for updates and stuff like that. But it could also be a real problem if you set that compliance setting down too low. So let's say you set it to 7 days. The next time that person gets back onto site and powers up their laptop, nothing's changed, but their laptop is now marked as uncompliant or not compliant. So you want to really, this is not a setting where you can say, you know, the standard is 30 days, 60 days, whatever the case. It's going to vary for every organization. 30 days may work for you, but I often say sort of just think about that one, and you know, 14 days is probably better, unless you have, you know, real reasons not to do that. Mistake two is what we call, I guess, what I call open enrollment, right? And this is another one of those out of the box settings where sort of by default there is a default enrollment policy in Intune that applies to all user enrollments until a higher priority enrollment policy is actually assigned. So if you don't actually create enrollment policies for your devices, what ends up happening is the default enrollment policy will apply. And unfortunately, what that does is it allows there's no real restrictions on the enrollments, right? So you can then enroll personal devices, and this is something I see very often is folks set up all of the other policies, but they don't have an enrollment policy. And so the user gets a company issued phone, which they enroll, and that one works great. But then they're at home, they're like, well, all I had to do was install Company Portal and sign in, and then I can enroll my Android phone or my personal device. So why wouldn't I just do that, right? Well, if you don't have any enrollment policies, enrollment restrictions, that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to end up with personal devices being enrolled, jailbroken devices being enrolled, unsupported hardware, old OSs, all sorts of stuff like that. So, you know, the tip here is to make sure that you actually set platform restrictions, set your enrollment policies properly. You have to keep these up to date as well, right? Because when a new version of iOS or Android come out, you probably want to up your minimum version requirement for OS for the OS on the device, stuff like that. So again, not set and forget, but spend the time setting up the enrollment policy so that you don't have this open enrollment problem, and only devices that you want to be enrolled and that you know are going to, you know, be able to meet your compliance policies and stuff can be enrolled. So that's a really big one. Mistake three is not using assignment filters. And man, I see this one a lot as well. And to me, assignment filters are one of the coolest things in Intune, right? And so what they are, assignment filters, is they allow you to assign policies based on really granular things, right? So think about the ability to do something like a KQL query, and then, you know, to filter using a KQL query, right? Is essentially kind of what it is, I guess. So you can create a assignment filter and filter things based on sort of OS version and manufacturer and device type and all sorts of stuff like that. And it really helps you narrow the scope of where your policies need to apply. What I often see when I work with customers is that they create groups for everything. So you create some policies. Let's say you have a policy for iPhones for work devices, iPhone company devices, iPhone personal devices, Android company devices, and Android personal devices. That's 4 policies. Then they go create enter groups, security groups for each one of those policies, and only put the users in those groups and stuff like that, to apply the policy to you know, at a group level. Well, that becomes really problematic when you have possibly a user that has multiple categories of device, right, or things like that. So being able to just apply the policy at a high level sort of blanket and then filter out the things that you don't want is much easier and a lot less messy. And you'll save yourself a lot of enter groups if you can do that way. So if you picture, for example, having a compliance policy that says you want a complex PIN or a biometric logon, right? And you apply that to all devices. Now, that's going to work great for user laptops and stuff like that. But as soon as you start deploying things like Teams rooms or maybe kiosk machines that are shared, all of a sudden those machines now can't actually meet those requirements. They can't satisfy those policy requirements, and they become non-compliant. So a great way to filter is you keep the same policy, but you create a filter that says, well, let's look for a characteristic of these Teams rooms, right? So Teams rooms, commonly, depending on which one you have, they may be manufactured by Lenovo or Yealink, or they may be Android OS or something like that. And so you can filter that policy to not apply to whatever that is. Excuse me. And I have some examples, or an example in the show notes. This is really powerful. You can filter in and you can filter out.
It reminds me of the filtering language PowerShell uses as well, right?
Yes, yeah, it's very similar. I don't think it's quite KQL, but it is very similar. If you're used to writing sort of filters in PowerShell, and if you're used to KQL, you could probably figure it
Yeah,
out really quickly as well. And it's not necessarily very. I mean, they can get complicated if you're chaining a lot of filters together, but
yeah,
typically they're pretty pretty easy. We generally when I'm designing an Intune deployment, one of the things I do as a part of the design is design out all of the assignment filters, because then it's very easy for you to say, well, you've got this policy, we're going to apply it in this way with this filter, and that kind of makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
So last thing, last mistake that I see is not using conditional access.
This is
And
not
now the
only an
things.
Intune mistake, Chris.
Correct. This is not only an Intune mistake, right? A lot of folks look at conditional access and go, well, this is really, really complicated, right? Generally conditional access can be complicated, but conditional access should be the cornerstone and that real foundation of your sort of identity and access management strategy. Like you have to be using conditional access to make those sort of risk-based decisions for access. Now, if you think about devices, what are you getting? You're getting compliance, right? These compliance policies are really, really powerful, but if you're not doing anything with the data, they're not anything, right? So a non-compliant device should not be allowed anywhere near your environment. If a device falls out of compliance, you want to understand why that is. You want to block access until that is fixed, right? Think about the scenario where someone jailbreaks their device or something like that. As soon as you pick up on that and that device becomes not compliant, you don't want it accessing any of your systems. So, those compliance policies by themselves, though, it's just reporting, right? Compliant, not compliant, red or green. That's all it is. It doesn't block anything unless you layer it into a conditional access policy where the conditional access policy has an action to do something, right? And it doesn't always have to be block. You can obviously do anything that you can do with conditional access, but really, really important to kind of take a look at those devices and then block access to things if they fall out of compliance or require compliance for access to certain things, right? Commonly, you would, if you have a system that, I don't know, a timesheeting system, or maybe your service management system, something like that, where you're going to allow folks to access it remotely, but you want to make sure that they're using a known or a compliant device, right? Without that, if they're just using their own personal laptop at home, not going to get to it. So important to use that compliance status, and that compliance data in conditional access. That'll be really good. Obviously, as we always do with anything in conditional access, start with report only. Report only is your friend with all of the stuff, because you can actually see what's happening, what the result of this is going to be before you actually enforce it. And there's really no excuse to not enforce something if you can safely test the impact first. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and don't forget to follow up on those report onlys later, because if it's in report only, you're not actually adding security here, of course.
100%. Yeah, it should be a short-term thing, 1 week, 2 weeks, something like
Yeah.
that, just to be able to gather data, and then make a decision as to the policy is either working, let's enforce it, or the policy is not working, let's tweak it and go back to that cycle, right? So
I saw a post from Jan Bakker the other day. He announced that Microsoft increased the amount of conditional access policies you can now have. The prior limit was 195 conditional access policies, and it now has been increased to 240. And I'm not sure if
yeah,
this was
that's
good or bad
scary.
news. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's scary, man. I don't know. I don't know that I want to manage an environment with even 190 policies. That's crazy. I think if you start getting to that, and folks, I've seen some best practice guides for conditional access policies online where folks have built out like template policies,
Yeah.
and there's like 50 or 60 policies in there. I mean, I don't know. That to me just seems really excessive. You should, in my opinion, you should always be least possible, right? Now, maybe your environment is that large and you have that many apps where you can be, creating a policy per app or what have you. But damn, man, that's a lot of policy. That's very, very easy to miss a misconfiguration when you have that many policies.
And
Yeah.
also to troubleshoot, because when you're encountering a certain issue, how are you
Mm.
going to visualize in your head what the applied effect is of all those conditional access policies to a user or
Yeah.
device?
Yeah, the what if stuff is really good for seeing what's happening,
Yeah.
but even then, like it's very complicated to have that many policies.
Yeah. You could obviously also use AI to help you with visualizing and getting a grasp of all the conditional access policies.
AI is very, very good at that, and it will definitely, if you feed it your JSON of all your
Yeah.
policies, it can give you some really good insights into
Yeah.
what your
Yeah.
policies are doing and where gaps are. Because ultimately, when you have all those policies, it's really difficult to see the gaps.
I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I'm a full-time Claude Code user nowadays, and I am really excited about how Claude is helping me log into the environment for me with read permissions, for example, using Azure CLI, pulling data in from the APIs, and solving the problem for me, and without me having to export JSON files manually in between, for example. So I've been using AI assistants for a couple of years now, as we all do, I think. I started with ChatGPT. I'm still using it sometimes. I think it's still great in creating images, for example. Moving to Copilot inside the M365 suite. But I was also a heavy GitHub Copilot user in VS Code for all my SOC and development work I was doing. All useful stuff, but in the last couple of months, like I said, I switched to Anthropic's Claude Code as my daily driver. And the difference, to be honest, is on another level. And I did not expect the gap to be this big, to be honest. And again, I'm not having a commercial about Anthropic Claude here in this episode. I'm just trying to explain why the experience differed so much. And even when you think you're comparing apples to apples, for example, you can use Claude's Sonnet model now in multiple different tools. And this is only, I think, half of the solution. It's what the industry named it, the harness. It's more like a lot of tools surrounding the LLM. And I want to dig into that a little bit more closely in a second. But before we get there, I have 2 or 3 stories which I experienced in the last couple of months where Claude Code literally saved me multiple days of work. And I like to share this with everybody, and I hope it inspires everybody to give it a try as well. So the first one was an investigation of a security incident. A company reached out to my company. It was not a customer right then. They suspected they had a problem. They built a lot of public-facing APIs around Azure API management services, assuming that because they run Azure API management, all the traffic flows through API management in Azure, and the backend and everything is secured by design as a result of that. But the reality was a little bit worse. They discovered by accident that they somehow published their APIM, so that's Azure API Management Services, subscription key, the master encryption key, somewhere on a website, which is already very bad, of course, because that makes you able to retrieve all the information and even make changes through the API and manage the entire resource. And with that, an attacker could potentially read not only the APIM information, but also see the full list of all backend services with all the exact URLs where APIM is forwarding your API towards. So you could have something like, api.everydaydefender.com, and it resolves into a backend service with some kind of random Azure function name or an app service or a logic app or whatever. Most of those backend services were directly reachable over the public internet as well, because they were just configured as public resources. So there was no VNet integration, no private link, no IP restriction, nothing actually forcing the traffic to only be accessible through Azure API Management Services. And worst of all, because the master key was leaked or temporarily available, you could potentially see all the configuration in APIM. So even if the backend services was maybe using some kind of authentication or very specific headers to verify requests, you could pull those in through APIM, and you could reconstruct your API request locally to talk with the backend services in that way. So what is exactly exposed? How do we plug the holes? And which should we prioritize first? And this was where Claude Code really shined for me, because I explained the situation. Claude told me that he needed Azure CLI to get information in the environment, so it installed it for me when I agreed with doing that. I'm not an Azure CLI user, so it wasn't installed yet apparently. And then it crawled through the entire Azure estate and mapped out all the front ends and back end services with all the Azure Resource ID, which resources were what. It checked if it was publicly accessible, because obviously Claude can check if the service is reachable from the outside. And it also created a completely prioritized remediation list for me. And not just these are exposed, but also here is how to reconfigure each of them. Because it has knowledge about the type of backend service, like for example, a logic app should be treated differently, maybe with IP whitelisting or a private link. The customer was able to start right away with closing the holes right away. And obviously, I could have gotten there by hand, of course, but this took me only an afternoon to write a report, and the report was written by Claude as well. So I had a Word document which I could handle to the customer, and they could start working on it. And this was so much more work because I didn't know the environment up front. There were multiple Azure subscriptions with, I don't know, maybe over 100 backend services. It would have taken me a lot of time if I would have investigated this manually.
Wow.
And and again, I just asked read permissions in the environment from the customer and used my credentials to authenticate with Claude and make it crawl across the environment. And obviously, I had to check a lot of stuff. So there was also a lot of stuff. That's also one of the takeaways I want to give right away. Double check the results every time. Don't trust it to be right, because I've seen multiple instances where it is very confident in telling me that a solution is the answer. And when I correct him and I say, you're wrong because this or that, it always comes back with, you're completely right. You're totally right. It always agrees with me. And when it's even providing me the wrong answers, it's very confident in providing me the wrong answers. So you really have to stay sharp and make sure you double check all the output. But even then, it's amazing what it could do in this instance.
That is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So the mechanics of that, though, like, it's controlling your machine and downloading and installing stuff. Is that because you're using the sort of the desktop client and the co-work stuff, or how's that actually? What's the mechanics?
That's actually a good question. So in Claude, you have multiple tabs or multiple ways to interact with Claude. So you have the Claude, the chat, that's similar to ChatGPT. You can just type in questions. There's even voice assist specifically for Nick to talk with. I'm not sure it has a nice voice or anything. To talk back. I don't use it that often. Then you have co-work, and co-work lets you create Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, Excel sheets, you name it. It is very useful to combining a lot of Office documents and let it co-work with you on a project, for example. And then you have Claude Code, which is my favorite, and I just spin it up from a terminal, which I have open all the time anyway, because I'm doing a lot of PowerShell stuff throughout the day. So I just type in Claude in terminal, and I'm just typing away there. And the great thing about the integration with the CLI, but I'm touching on this a little bit more later in the episode, your tools already live there. So PowerShell lives there, your files are there, your Git repos are there, all the other tools are there. MCP connections are natively integrated into Claude Code, so it can reach out, for example, into your Sentinel environment or Defender environment to retrieve data. And that's awesome with Claude Code. And I obviously like the ASCII aesthetic of everything, but I'll touch on that later as well. Yeah, and when it needs something, so let me skip my second example and go to the third example I brought. So I made a recording with Maarten during MVP Summit about the masterclass, the Xpress Live masterclass we're going to provide on the pre-day of Xpress Live. And we were so enthusiastic that we recorded everything in Dutch. And then later we thought, well, we want to be open to English-speaking people as well. So we can do both Dutch and English. So maybe we should have recorded it in English. So I didn't want to throw away the recording because I think it was a nice announcement. So I thought I need subtitles. So I asked Claude, well, here's my file. I need subtitles for it in English. Can we do this? I have never done this. And it came with the idea to install OpenAI's Whisper, which is a cloud a CLI tool which can transcribe audio and video for you. So it did that. It installed the tool, it transcribed the video, and then it translated it into English and provided me a subtitle file, so the SRT extension, with all the time codes in English subtitles. And it even asked me, which video editor are you using? Well, you and me are using DaVinci Resolve. So I explained it to him. And then he wrote a step-by-step tutorial for me how to implement the subscription, the subtitle into the video and apply it there and export it. Again, it installed a tool for me. Well, I had to agree with that. So there are a lot of permission questions in between. So by default, you have to verify every step it wants to take, even if it needs to crawl through directories on your machine, and if it wants to install scripts or create scripts for that matter and run them locally, you have to approve that individually.
That's pretty cool. But what you're also saying now is that you want Dutch subtitles for this show, don't you?
Well, we can do that. It's actually quite easy.
Because we do get an SRT file. We already get the SRT file, so we'll just Dutch subtitle it.
But do you want the subtitles to be in Dutch or Zuid-Afrikaans, or what do you want, Chris?
I would say Dutch, right? That's very. We got to be, inclusive to the encrypted nation.
Well, that's a great thing. And talking about languages, this is the great thing with AI, of course, because it can be language agnostic in that way. So we can even add Chinese subtitles if we would like. And that brings me to the second example I wanted to bring. So with a customer of mine, we were discussing connecting their HR applications to our managed detection and response service, because obviously the HR application contains a lot of sensitive information, and they wanted to have some detections and some monitoring in place for that. So maybe, for example, an unwanted bank account change could indicate a bank fraud, for example, or maybe somebody getting a very high level of HR privileges in the HR tool is not something that should happen very often. So if that happened, you maybe want to investigate if the user was not compromised. And this customer had a lot of local authentications to the HR tool as well. People need to authenticate themselves with their private email address, for example, as well. So not everything is protected by Entra ID in that regard. So we had a couple of ideas of detections we wanted to apply. The thing is, we connected the application to Microsoft Sentinel. There's even a default connector for that, which is great. So we had the logs sitting in Sentinel for a couple of weeks now. But I had to brainstorm with Claude on some use cases. I provided the Word document the customer has provided me with a wish list of potential detections. So it read the Word document and pointed out where the workspace actually lives from the customer. It was able to connect through MCP into Sentinel. We already did a couple of simulations. So, for example, we let somebody deliberately change their bank account information to see what it would show up like in the logs in Sentinel. But the problem was most of the logs were in French.
Right.
So the logs were actually having French descriptions. So it was impossible for me to find a needle in the haystack like this. But obviously Claude didn't care, so it just sifted through all the logs and found those activities based from the Word document, the detections we wanted to achieve. And then it created the KQL queries for me, and I even told it where our repository is with all the JSON-described analytic rules for Sentinel. We use a combination of the default ARM template with some custom properties we use inside the company ourselves. And it was even able to look at the existing analytic rules, create a JSON definition of the new rules, which we could just commit into the Git repo and publish that way. It was even able to add a table in the KQL query to do the translation for me from French to English and all the relevant alerts, so that the actual incident landing in Sentinel was actually in English, even though the underlying logs were in French.
Wow.
And
that is a big time saver, isn't it? When it can do all that type of stuff.
It was.
Even just thinking about all those steps, just thinking about them there's a lot there, right? And wow.
Yeah, and of course, I could have exported logs. I would have ended up with a massive CSV file. I had to translate it with Google Translate. I don't know even if I could have fed all of those rows in there or do it in sections. And I just asked Claude, and I thought, well, let's see where it brings me. And eventually, it was able to complete all the tasks. And again, this is really where I thought, okay, this is mind-blowing. This would have cost me multiple days of work, if not more. And now it was, again, somewhat like an afternoon and a short follow-up with some fine-tuning later. But really, really amazing stuff.
So when you use Claude Code in the terminal, does it still have the context and the background that it would have? So when you use Claude Chat, for example, you have a history of all of your previous chats, and it's built up a history of you as the user. It knows the things that you you have asked for in the past, and it
Yeah.
keeps that context, right?
Yeah.
Claude Code has that same context and as well.
Yes and no. So I am
Okay.
learning a lot of stuff as well lately, and maybe if people are interested and want to know more about daily best practices when using Claude and Claude Code, we can. I can revisit the topic in a later episode. But there are a couple of things you should be aware of. There is a general memory Claude has about you, about me, my job, what kind of work
Mm-hmm.
that I do, but it will not go as far to remember every teeny bit of detail we discussed with all the chats and all the Claude Code sessions, because it's just too much
Too much.
information. You get a lot of hallucination if you're not careful, so that's why they really keep it very compact, as like more information about who I am and what kind of work that I do. You are right. Every time I open up a new Claude Code session and I want to retrieve data from a customer from Sentinel, for example, it goes through the same steps every time. It asks me, okay, do you want to use MCP? Do you want to use Azure CLI? Is it installed or not? And then I have to go through the same questions every time. Well, what I can do right now, I created a Claude.md, a markdown file in my Git repository where all my detections live from my company. And in that Claude.md is an instruction set created by Claude in an earlier session, because I asked him to do that, because I was like, I'm not going to explain you every time how this is going to work. And he says, okay, well, let me create a Claude file from myself. And every time you open me in this repository, I will read the instruction file and I know what you expect from me in this context.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, you hear people talk about Claude.mds all the time, and I guess now it's good to understand the context and sort of the use case for it. So that's cool.
Yeah, and if you're doing some heavy lifting, which you don't need every time you open up Claude, you can also write your own plugins. And plugins are also a set of instruction sets. And plugins can also be shared with team members. So we are using a Claude Enterprise subscription right now in the company. So I can even make plugins available for my team members, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Very nice. Very cool.
Yeah. So why does Claude Code specifically feel so different to me? And that is where the harness question comes in. So this confused me for a while. You can pick Claude Sonnet 4.6, for example, which is the LLM inside GitHub Copilot. And you can also pick it inside Cursor. And you can pick it inside Claude Code. It has the same model, the same training, the same context window. So why is the experience so different then? And the answer lies in you're not only using a model, you're also using the harness. And the harness is the full runtime wrapper around the LLM that turns it into a text in and text out function and into something that actually does the work for you. And the harness includes a couple of components, and I'm not going too much into detail. I put a couple of links in the show notes if you want to read more. But how does the model get called repeatedly, and what triggers a new turn, and how does it stop, and does it self-verify, or what kind of tools are available, like file read, file edit, grep, web fetches, web search, those kind of things. That is past the model. That is all part of the harness. And also the hooks are an important thing. So a hook is a shell command that harness runs automatically in response to a specific event in the life cycle of the agent. And at times it will forget one. So hooks will turn the guidance into guarantees. So you might remember having a request with ChatGPT once where you say, please cut down on the amount of emojis, or I don't want to see those M dashes anymore in your responses. And still, it will remember 95 times, and then once it will forget. And that's where the hooks are so important, to keep applying the guidance to the LLM.
Those dashes, man, that thing has become a nightmare, because I've always written my style of writing. I use dashes to separate thoughts, right? Or if I'm talking about, so I think, and it's just a way I've learned, I've developed to my writing style over the years, right? And if you go and read my blog and you read some stuff, you can go way back, you'll see that it's a way that I've always written is I use dashes. I use dashes more than I use commas, right? To separate thoughts or things like that. And now with AI, everything I write, people think I've just AI generated it, and it's annoying because that's just how I write. But of course, AI does that as well. Now, I guess the main difference is I use sort of an N dash, the smaller dash rather than the big M
Yeah.
dash. But
Yeah.
most people don't understand the difference or don't know the difference of
Yeah.
those, and so they just assume everything I give them is always AI written and AI
Yeah,
generated.
maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned in this regard, but
Yeah,
I think an M dash is a dead giveaway of somebody just copy and pasting the output from an LLM and pasting it in an email or something like that. To be honest, it comes across to me as less truthful and less sincere in that regard, because an
yeah,
M dash is used in print in with books and documents, because you have to emphasize a certain part of the sentence, right? But the M dash is
right,
not actually a key on your keyboard. So how were
right,
you
right,
typing that M dash if you're not copying
right.
it over from an LLM?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's a good way to tell the difference, right? But a lot of folks, they just see the dash and they go, "Oh, you've copied that." I'm like, no, no, no.
yeah,
Look, if you look real closely, you'll see that's an N dash. It's different. It's just
yeah. I even asked Claude by now to read through all my blogs on Medium and construct some giveaways of my specific language uses, because those were all written by me. So I
yeah,
use semicolons, for example, quite often, and I like to
yeah,
double quote certain words or emphasize things with double quotes. And it actually was able to pick that up, and now I can just ask him to output something in my personal writing style. And I'm still editing it and removing stuff, but it comes across even already better as it
yeah,
is.
yeah. So it's not Claude code anymore; it's Koos code, right?
It's Koos code. Yeah. We see a big resurgence in CLI, or TUI, as it's called. You introduced me to this term last episode, Chris, I believe.
That's right. That's right. The text user
So
interface.
the TUI, it's also a traveling agency in the Netherlands, so not to be confused by that. But it's when we say TUI, we're talking about the terminal user interface, right?
That's right.
I'm seeing a real cultural shift happening as of late. So tools like Claude Code, GitHub Copilot CLI, and also Cursor has the Cursor agent CLI. And they have quietly become some of the devs' primary interface to work with AI. So terminals have never been more alive, I would say. And I'm happy for that, because it feels like the quickest way possible to get things done. And that's why I thought Terminal Velocity was a fitting title for today's episode. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. Remember when touchscreens came out on every Windows device, and everyone said, "Why is Apple not got a touchscreen?" Because, well, we use the terminal, man, and we don't care about
Yeah.
touching the screen, right? So yeah, I am,
Touching the screen on the laptop is
yeah. So I'm very happy about this terminal resurgence and being able to work from the terminal. I like you. I always have a terminal open. There's always a window open on my machine because I'm always doing stuff in the terminal.
And for people who grew up in the 90s and zeros, I want to have a shameless plug here on a blog I've written a couple of years ago now, over the holidays, where I wrote some sort of love letter to ASCII and ANSI art and the whole BBS and LAN party scene I was in back then in my early 20s. So if people recognize this and think that's fun, there's a link in the show notes to that article.
And that was a very big inspiration, actually. I mean, there's a bit of a backstory, but a bit of a really big inspiration for the branding and the theme of this podcast, right? When we were talking about season 1, especially, we went sort of very deep into that stuff, and our theme tune still is very much sort of inspired by that sort of ASCII sort of ANSI culture. So very cool. It's
the Sega Mega Drive or the Super Nintendo comes to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to round things off in the AI space for now, it obviously depends a little bit on what kind of user you are, which AI tool might suit you best. I think my colleagues from sales are very happy with what Microsoft Copilot is providing them, especially with the new co-work feature, similar to what Cloud Coworks does. But I think especially for the developers, the defenders, like yourself, connecting with Intune, also with scripts and APIs, I think Claude Code really might have an advantage right now, I must add. And Microsoft is also embracing the multi-model thing as well, because now in Copilot, they actually added a feature where you could use the Copilot researcher to do some research. And it has the option to generate an output with multiple models at once. So you will see ChatGPT output on the left and Claude Sonnet output on the right. and you can actually compare, and it will use a different LLM to assess the differences between the output between the two. So you really get a disagreements and an agreements overview between multiple models in your research, which I think is very valuable as well. I'll put a video in under this edit where I'll demonstrate that, because I tried it out last night when it got released.
Oh, very nice. Very
Um,
cool.
yeah, and in regards to pricing, I think pricing might seem high at first, but I think you should try it and see what it brings you. A Claude Max subscription, for example, of €100 a month, or a GitHub Copilot Pro Plus, which is, I think, 40 or 50 euros a month. I think personally the subscription pays for itself within a week if you actually use it. So give it a try, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. Interesting. I think I have a Claude. I have the Claude Pro. I have the $20 one, and I mean I do use it a lot too.
Okay.
But I don't think my use case is quite as much as you do. We, work from a work perspective. We obviously have GitHub Copilot. Um, we have Copilot, but we have like an enterprise ChatGPT workspace as well, right? So
Oh, yeah.
we have obviously policies around what we can use, especially when it comes to customer data and stuff like that. We have we have governance policies in place. But in my personal life, yeah, I also use Claude, and I have it running on my personal machine at least for some of the things that I work on. I do think it's a very valuable tool.
You bring up a good point, because the data boundaries is obviously a very valid concern.
Mm.
And I believe, but I don't know the specific details, but because I wasn't involved in the acquisition of the Claude subscription we have right now. But I believe you need an enterprise subscription if you want to make sure the data stays within the EU boundary as an EU customer. And that's obviously important to us. So so that's also why we switched to that plan.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Talking about TUIs.
Yeah, really inspired by what you were going to talk about, and it's something I came across just yesterday. In fact, I tagged you on LinkedIn with this the community project Intui. So terminal user interface for Intune by, and I'm going to try Jorge Suarez, I think is his name. He's a endpoint MVP.
I think you're doing a great job there.
Yeah, endpoint MVP. Man, I love this. I think this is super cool and super geeky. And I was messing around with it today. It was really speedy for me, really quick, which I really liked. I also really like the fact that it has like a really cool sort of connectivity or connection workflow, so you can actually connect using browser auth or device code or service principal, all sorts of stuff like that. He's definitely put a lot of thought into this. So I'd say to anyone who's sort of jumping on the terminal hype at the moment and wanting to do more from the terminal, go check out Intui, man. Especially if you work with Intune, obviously you're gonna find it to be really really cool. I've not used every single feature, but it's got some really cool tools here that I think are really helpful and really useful. Especially if you're living in Intune. One of the things I absolutely hate about the Intune portal is how, not just the Intune portal, all of the Microsoft admin centers, is that just timing out, right? Which I guess you want stuff timing out all the time, because from a security perspective, you don't want to just keep your sessions open. But there's nothing worse than having to do something really quickly. You click a link and then all of a sudden, boom, you're logged out or whatever, or what have you. So, can be frustrating. Hey, check out Intui.
Well, it's great that it has some really advanced features and that you like it in conjunction with your work you did with Intune. But to Jorge, if I pronounce correctly, I want to say you had me at TUI because the user interface looks amazing, and he even added some nice coloring and some nice lines and some nice terminal graphics in there. And that's why I mentioned to you on LinkedIn as well. I have to install it just to see how he accomplished that within PowerShell. Running on a Mac, by the way.
Yeah, running on a Mac. I would say check out the GitHub repo for it, because there's a lot of stuff in there. The documentation's good. That's the one thing I would say, Jorge, is when you shared this on LinkedIn, you didn't link to it, bro. So obviously you could just install it through the PowerShell gallery. But if you really want to dig into like the workings of it, I found the GitHub repo, and I've put a link in the show notes, so you can go and find it.
And I see Jorge uses Claude code as well, because he has a .claude folder in the GitHub repo as well. So that's a giveaway.
There you go. Fair enough. We've had a longer episode today, so obviously we're talking, and we appreciate you folks joining us as always. So this would be episode 4 in the can for season 2. No. This is going to be for May. The June episode will be in person again, so looking forward to doing that, Koos. And well, if we make that work, and folks, if you have any feedback, if you're interested in Claude and some tips and tricks and how Koos is saving years and hours of time with his day job, let us know, and we'll do some more with it. And if not, anything else that's on your mind, please do let us know. If you do build tools or have a community project, doesn't have to be a tool. It can be any community project, even if you're working on maybe conferences and stuff like that, or whatever you have that is for the community. And you'd like for us to talk about it and give it a plug, please do reach out as well, and we will do that. If you are in the Netherlands, please take a look at Experts Live Netherlands, which is, I think, the 1st and 2nd of June. Koos, I might have to get you to pronounce the name of the city where it is being hosted.
Nieuwegein. And also, for people not knowing, there's a pre-day this year for people in the Netherlands. I would really encourage you to look at the masterclasses which are taking place on the pre-day. And myself, together with a couple of other organizers from the Dutch Microsoft Security Meetup, we host 6 times a year. We are having a masterclass with a capture the flag, a guided capture the flag on Microsoft Security. So we'll be having an environment where people have to hunt through a Defender environment, find threats, and in between we'll having some theory and a nice pub quiz at the end of the day. So make sure to check that out and buy a ticket if you still can.
Yep, I will be there. So looking forward to it. Wrapping up another episode. Thank you again for listening, and we will see you at the next one. Bye-bye.
See you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.